Hello all and welcome back to another Hyper Blue Reviews. Today's review is going to focus on a game that I absolutely love, Darkseed 2. If you remember my top 10 DOS games you have to try, then this should come as no surprise. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to get into spoilers if I want to do this game justice, so you've been warned. That being said, let's dive a little deeper into Darkseed 2. Just be careful not to lose your head in the process.
Hey, you missed, pal.
Darkseed 2 is a Windows 3 game that was released in 1995. The game was ported to the macOS, PlayStation 1, and Sega Saturn. Again, the PlayStation 1 and Saturn versions were only released in Japan. I have seen gameplay from the PlayStation 1 version, and not much is different besides the spoken and written languages and a few graphical differences and glitches. For this review though, I'll be focusing on the Windows version. So what's Darkseed 2 about? Well, a year passes by after the events of the first game, and Mike isn't handling it too well. He's had a mental breakdown and has moved back in with his mom in Crowley, Texas. He's plagued by nightmares of the ancients and the dark world, and the nightmares do seem to be getting worse and worse. Not only that, but he's the main suspect in the murder of his high school sweetheart, Rita Scanlon. To make matters even worse, Mike receives a message from the Keeper of the Scrolls stating that the ancients are back. Mike instantly believes that the ancients are actually the ones responsible for Rita's death. So apparently their plan was to implant an embryo in Mike's head and, if that fails, frame him for murder. I am being a bit facetious, as Mike ends up finding another portal to the Dark World and sees that the ancients are using human heads to power a generator. The ancients are creating a beast known as the Behemoth to go to Earth and drain it of its life force. They also send a being known as the Shapeshifter to gather heads needed for their generator. There's only one person that stands in their way, the mustachioed machismo himself, Mike Dawson. So, Darkseed 2 plays very similarly to Darkseed 1. It's a point-and-click game with branching dialogue options. Unlike Darkseed 1, Darkseed 2 isn't bound to a time limit, with the exception of the final boss. So the player can take a leisurely pace and enjoy the environment of the game more. There are also less insta-kills in Darkseed 2. They're still there, but you're given enough warning prior to them happening, especially if you look before you interact. The look and feel of Darkseed 2 is completely different than the first. I'm not entirely sure if I mean that in a good way or not yet, but it is different. While the backgrounds in Darkseed 2 are more bright and vibrant than its predecessor, the foregrounds and backgrounds are also more of a mismatch of random objects in certain areas. It's like the designers had a selection of random pictures to use, and they ended up adding random stuff to it anyway. Take Gargon's spot, for example. There's a random smiley face in the upper right corner of the screen for no reason whatsoever. Doc Larson's mortuary also has a lot of random stuff in it as well, like a Bunsen burner and a ticket dispenser. Mike's house even has a confusing interior design as well, as none of the rooms really match up. All that being said though, the Dark World areas look great. The backgrounds are more H.R. Geiger art, and as I already mentioned, they do look fantastic. The puzzles in Darkseed 2 are somewhat lacking. None of them require a lot of thought or item finding. If you remember from Darkseed 1, you had to find very small items on pixelated floors, use scotch as gas, or even powering up hammers. Darkseed 2 doesn't really have any of that. The items are called out better in Darkseed 2, so they're a little bit easier to collect than the previous game. There's also nothing that prevents the player from being able to complete the game or not. Besides maybe potential bugs and glitches, but I've never experienced those. For instance, in Darkseed 1, if the player missed an item or timed event, then they couldn't win the game. In Darkseed 2, the player has the chance to find and use every item in the game. There is a possibility that you can use certain items at wrong times, but I could never get that to happen. In my opinion, it makes for a more enjoyable experience. Because you don't have to memorize item locations. Back to the puzzles though. They're all pretty easy and not that intuitive. They mostly require the player to walk around and talk to the townsfolk in order to solve. Even the puzzles that require an item to complete are relatively easy. The items that are needed to solve puzzles are either locked behind a door that's easily opened or out in the open. The player can hover the cursor over objects to determine what Mike can and cannot interact with, so it's relatively easy to find things. I may be in a minority with this opinion, but I think that Darkseed 2's soundtrack is actually pretty good. I actually like it better than the first game's soundtrack. There's a unique song for every location in the game. The standouts for me are the Dark World songs and the Carnival theme. The Dark World theme gives a bit of mystery to the Dark World, and the Carnival theme is just fun. There's a mirror maze that is featured in this game, and it's one of the worst things I've ever experienced. I've stated in previous reviews and Let's Plays that I hate mazes, and this is a credo that I live by for game design. Mazes just arbitrarily lengthen the game, and I don't like them. The maze in Darkseed 2 is weird though because you're presented with a top-down perspective, and the player is expected to navigate Mike through areas with no mirrors. The only issue is that's really difficult because it's hard to differentiate open areas versus blocked areas. If you attempt to go through a block path, Mike will say,
"There's a mirror between me and this room."
He says this every single time you click on a mirror. Once you discern an open path from a block path, it gets a little easier to navigate, but it's still a pain. The player needs to navigate this maze 3 times overall. Once to get to a portal to the Dark World, once to get out of the mirror maze and into the Dark World, and once to race the behemoth. I mentioned that there's one spot that is timed, and that is the final confrontation between Mike and the behemoth. Mike has to race the behemoth to the portal to the light world. For every step Mike takes, the behemoth takes 2. So the player needs to map out the best route to take in order to beat him. If the behemoth gets to the portal first, then it's game over. However, if Mike gets to the portal first, you get to see some sweet fencing skills. Needless to say, I hate mazes with no time limits. I hate mazes with time limits even more. Of course, the player can map out the best route through the mirror maze at any time in the game, but how would they know to do that on their first playthrough? Here's a fun fact for you though. As I mentioned in my Darkseed 1 review, the character of Mike Dawson is based on and voiced by the real-life Mike Dawson. Mike Dawson in Darkseed 2 is actually played by another person, Chris Gilbert. It's weird that a video game company got to retain a real-life person's name and look for their franchise, but I'm sure Dawson was cool with it. Of course, maybe not, because Mike isn't the most heroic character. In fact, he's even whiny at times. Okay, so I've talked about things that I've liked and disliked about the game. Let's talk more about the story. Here's your spoiler warning. If you don't want to get spoiled on the plot, twists and turns, etc., then skip ahead. I'll put a dancing Iceman in the corner of the video to warn which sections contain spoilers. So skip ahead to a part that doesn't have Iceman if you don't want to get spoiled. Now that that's established, let's talk about the story. The plot of Darkseed 2 is honestly all over the place. The main plot revolves around Mike trying to solve the murder of Rita Scanlon. All signs point to him, but he denies the accusations. There are also a lot of other plot points that don't really go anywhere, such as the arsonist subplot, a clown with a headache, and a reading group that's actually a satanic cult. Granted, the last one is somewhat tied to the plot, but honestly, not really. There's also the plot point that Mike is trying to stop a Dark World shapeshifter from killing people and using their heads for the Ancient's generator. Mike spends a lot of time accusing the townspeople of murder and thinking that they're all the shapeshifter. It turns out that Mikey Boy is both the murderer and shapeshifter. Technically, I guess. The story doesn't make sense the way it's told because it's told by way of an unreliable narrator. At least that's how I've written it in my head. We can't really trust any of the details from Mike's point of view because of Mike's mental capacity. It's unclear if the events of Darkseed 1 really happened, but regardless, Mike is traumatized. He invents an entirely new person to help him cope with whatever did happen. Enter Jack. Jack is completely in Mike's mind. Whatever Jack hears is actually what Mike hears. My theory is that whenever Mike is in the Dark World, that the Jack personality has taken over in the Light World, or at least when the story progresses. You can see this when Mike gets his hypnosis. Each dream is in different areas of the dark world, and each in an area that correlates to an event where he was there and can't remember, or that Jack was there and overheard something. That is all but the third dream sequence anyway. My guess is, by that point, Mike is so far gone that he imagines the craziest things. Like the game show sequence, the crazy interior of Paul's house, and the events that explain everything. Given that Jack and Mike are the same person, you also see that Jack is as crazy as Mike, especially with his speech at the end. He knows he's a split personality, but calls himself a shapeshifter anyway. I assume this all happens as Mike lays dying on the floor. It's just his way of coping with what's happening. Speaking of the ending sequence, I actually think that it's really cool. The player is supposed to assume the role of Jack, and he or she was supposed to be able to walk around the town and explore. But the developers couldn't program it correctly, so we ended up getting a scene just in the doctor's office. We still get to interact with everyone in Dr. Sim's office though as Jack, and then ultimately drive off into the sunset. Again, a lot of this is just speculation on my part, and me just trying to understand what I saw. I'm not sure if this was the writer's intention, but Darkseed 2 has so many possibilities of what's happening that it's just fun to think about. In fact, I might even do a separate video on some of the foreshadowing in Darkseed 2, mostly just because I want to see if it's possible to piece together if Mike is actually crazy, or just figure out if the Dark World actually does exist. Anyway, with that being said, no more spoilers. Okay, so I went on a long tirade about Darkseed 2, but that's honestly because I really like it. Darkseed 2 is a cult classic to me. The gameplay is nothing to write home about, but the story, voice acting, sound effects, and crazy scenarios are fantastic. It's definitely a game I recommend checking out, at least for the sake of checking out the insane story. The game does drag in some sections due to needing to talk to so many people, but the payoff at the end is well worth it. All that being said, I give Darkseed 2 3.5 floating Rita heads out of 5. Well, that does it for the reviews for 2021. I hope you enjoyed the selection of game and movie reviews from this past year. As always, thank you for watching, and
See you around, pal.
yeah, I know I already used this in another video, but let me explain why I used it again.